Hello and welcome to For the Health of It. I'm Lou Beccaria, your host, and thanks for tuning us in. The abuse of substances, as we all know, is one of the biggest social problems in America today. It has many ramifications and a high cost in human capital, such as the destruction of families, marriages, and lives in general. Likewise, it creates a heavy economic cost of our society due to its effect on production, employment, and more. What we, the average citizen, are not often aware of is that substance abuse is not a moral or a character defect, as much of the society would have us believe. It is, at its fundamental base, a disease of the mind. In this realm, the topic of our show today is the science of substance abuse as a brain disease. To talk about this extremely important angle of substance abuse is Dr. Deni Carise, a clinical psychologist and a world-famous substance abuse expert who has spent the last 30 years creating a better understanding of the disease of substance abuse. Dr. Carise is the Chief Scientific Officer of the Recovery Centers of America and a consultant to our local Phoenixville area substance abuse residential treatment community known as the Manor of Hope. Along with Dr. Carise is also Steve Killilly, the dynamic founder and CEO of the Manor of Hope, whose own family has been severely affected by substance abuse. Steve has been on a mission to revolutionize how we in America think about substance abuse and how it is treated as a long-term journey. So, Dr. Carise and Steve, welcome to the show. It's great to have you with us, and really looking forward to educating the public about your view of substance abuse. So, first, just tell us a little bit about your background. I know it's very extensive, but give us a capsule, Dr. Carise.
I guess I'm Deni Carise. I guess the capsule would be that when I got into my own recovery, I went back to school, and 9 years later, I had my Ph.D. and I started doing the science of addiction. I was an NIH funded researcher for about 18 years, and then I went back to my first love, which is clinical work, and I've run large systems of care for a couple of different companies. I've started treatment in a number of other countries. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. The important thing for me is that people know that people get well, that treatment can be effective no matter how many times you've had it before. It can always be effective, and that people go on to live great lives.
Wow.
Yeah.
You're a busy lady. Steve, tell us about you.
Well, if you talked to me 15 years ago, I would have never thought I would be sitting at this table talking about substance abuse. Due to some personal issues with my son, I was kind of dragged through the world of drug abuse and recovery and learned a whole lot. And through that process, became very empathetic to the people who are going through that, which includes family and extended family. And I decided that, and rather than sitting on the sidelines and complaining about things, I wanted to jump in and see what I could do to help. And so that's what I've dedicated my life to today.
And that's how you came about founding Manor of Hope.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's kind of get into the substance of this. Why do people historically consider substance abuse as a moral failure and a defect of character?
Right. I mean, I think historically people consider it that because we didn't have the science of genetics, the neuronal advances that we have today. We didn't know what we know today medically. I think the general public has an issue with calling it a disease because they believe that if we call it a disease, that absolves the person of their bad behavior around the disease. And that's not it at all. Calling it a disease is because it's got these genetic components. It's not like sickle cell or cystic fibrosis. There's one gene, it turns it on, and you definitely have it. There's multiple genes, but it's also important to know that genetics is not destiny. It doesn't mean you're going to have it. So there's genes responsible for whether or not you're likely to become addicted, how hard you find it to quit, whether or not you're likely to try drugs for the first time. So it's very complex, and I think that the issue of it being a moral failing really dates back to a time when we didn't have the science we have today.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I guess that what you just said, Doctor, might answer kind of the question. Some people will say, you've got two children in the same family, mm-hmm. and one becomes addicted to substances and another doesn't. Yeah. They both have grown up in the same environment and so forth. But I guess the answer is their brains were just wired differently?
Their brains are wired differently. I have even had identical twins. One had schizophrenia and one did not in my training earlier in years. So they both had the exact same genetic makeup. One gene expressed, the other one it did not express. So genes are not destiny, but they are a very big deal. They account for something like 60% of your likelihood to become addicted once you first pick up that drug. So it's not your fault, but it's your responsibility to take care of it once you know you have it. So nobody chooses to become addicted. And once you pick up that first drug, if you've got the genetic components, it's much more likely you'll become addicted, that you'll find it difficult to quit, et cetera. Yeah.
Is it fair to make an analogy with what you just said with people who suffer some aspect of mental illness? Like you just said, like you don't choose
Right.
that. People don't choose to be depressed or
Right.
to be suicidal or to be sociopathic and so forth. So is that fair to say that?
I think it's fair to make the analogy. We always want to acknowledge that somebody has to voluntarily typically take the drug first, but what happens after that is very similar. Yeah.
So what happens, Dr. Carise, to the brain when you become addicted to a certain substance, whether
Right.
it be alcohol or some form of drugs?
Yeah. So there's a whole kind of a sequela of events that happen that interplay with your environment, with your family, with your genetics and whatnot. The brain, I mean, pretty much whether it's eating a great chocolate cake, having, frankly, great sex, experiencing the bliss of the birth of a baby, it all comes down to, on a very gross level, a very general level, as an explosion of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. That is your pleasure center. And they've done studies on rats where they can self-administer, stimulation to that part of the brain, and they will do it to the exclusion of eating, sleeping until death. So that
Wow.
it's an incredibly strong area of the brain. What happens when you take the drugs is that it releases the dopamine. Now, some drugs release twice as much dopamine as any of those other things I talked about that occur naturally. The bliss of a baby being born, eating the chocolate. So it releases double the amount of dopamine, okay? So your body is not primed for that. It's not, ready to do that. Well, what about the drugs that can release up to 10 times as much of that dopamine? What happens are a couple of things. The brain stops developing its own dopamine because you're flooding it with dopamine from the outside. Your neurons might stop receiving. Your receptors might wither because there's, this flood of the drug and your brain's trying to deal with it. And then there's the issue of, frankly, it pains me to say this, but we were not meant to feel that good. We were not meant to feel this, a measure of 900 basal dopamine, scores in the brain when the everyday experience is about 200 at best, When you quit doing that, there's a whole group of things that happen that you have to readjust to that. Your brain has to readjust. There are periods of anhedonia or sadness, or there's craving for the drug, because you can imagine anything that's that rewarding is going to make you want to go back to it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That tremendous amount of, I'll call it over-application of dopamine that you just described, at that level, does it affect other aspects physically of a person? I mean, can it be damaging to somebody's health otherwise if you use the 900 versus 200?
Yeah. Yeah. So it can be damaging to all different areas, and that's just that's just the neurotransmitter that we know the most about, that's most impactful. There's dopamine D1 and D2 receptors. There's all different, things going on that are, more highly scientific that we won't go into. But some of the things that happen is that, there's biological and there's behavioral things that happen, of course. When you feel that great, you just want to feel that great again. It's just natural. That's why people eat a lot of sugar. That's why people like tobacco. It's why people like,
Donuts.
caffeine and donuts and, and it makes you want to do it again. Think of that times 10. Now, when you put your body in that kind of a state, there's a number of things that are going to happen. Your own neurotransmitters are going to be depleted because your brain's sending the signal, oh, we don't need to make that neurotransmitter. There's tons of it here already, right?
Okay.
So if then when you stop using the cocaine or the amphetamines or whatever your drug of choice is, you really have a deficiency, of that dopamine, and you're going to have to go through a time period where it's tough to feel pleasure in everyday things. At the same time, some of the things that come along with that high level of dopamine and the high, for example, from amphetamines, mean that you're probably not eating right. You're not sleeping right. You're not taking care of your teeth or your body in all different ways. So you're going to see a lot of other medical issues.
Right. Okay. Wow. That's awesome information. We're going to have to take a break right now. Please stay with us, folks. We're going to take a break for a commercial, and when we come back, we'll hear more from Dr. Carise and from Steve Carile. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to For the Health of It. For those of you who are just tuning in, we have the pleasure today of talking with Dr. Deni Carise and Steve Carile about the subject of substance abuse and how it is really a brain disease and not a failure of character. So, can addiction be cured, Dr. Carise?
It's a great question. Can addiction be cured like an appendicitis or like a broken bone? No. Absolutely not. And I used to see this all the time when I was working with a therapeutic community where parents would drop their kids off. And, it's kind of, it was this feeling of like, okay, great, you take, I'll be back in 30 days, it'll be all fixed. It's not like that. It's a chronic medical disease like diabetes, hypertension, asthma. Those also have no cures, right? But the goal is always self-management in the community with as little medical intervention as keeps the person healthy. So for somebody with type 2 diabetes, you want them to diet and exercise. If they need insulin, you want them to see the doc when they need a refill, but to be able to manage their disease in the community. It doesn't just go away like an appendicitis. Same thing for substance use disorder treatment. You want somebody to get through a safe, complete detoxification. You want to get them the services they need, whether that's medications, psychosocial therapy. You want to give them as long of a treatment as possible, and you want them to be able to manage their disease while in the community. Yeah.
So it's a lifelong journey.
It's a lifelong journey.
You've got to buy into this recovery for your lifetime.
Yeah.
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 So what are the treatment options that might be available for somebody who decides that they want to get off this train?
Yeah. Boy, the good news, the bad news is, as you know, we're in the middle of an epidemic in this country. The good news is we have never had so many avenues of treatment. So there's detoxification, which usually should typically be done in a residential setting. The detoxification process from alcohol or benzodiazepines like Valium or Xanax, those can be deadly. You can die from withdrawal of those drugs. Heroin, what I typically say is you will want to die, but you probably won't die from withdrawal of that, but it should still be done under close medical care. So there's detoxification, which is just the start of getting the body healthier. There's residential or inpatient treatment where somebody may stay 30 days, 21 days, whatever. There's no magic in that number. It's typically like an insurance number, frankly. But what I love about residential care is that it's a time where you can get medical checkups, psychiatric care, all different groups. You get 10, 12 hours of therapy a day. I mean, think of how long that would take you in an outpatient setting. Yeah. But the reality is that that is just the start. It is really just the beginning. What you really need is longer-term care. So there's intensive outpatient, which is typically 3 hours a day, 3-4 days a week. There's traditional outpatient, 1 or 2 hours a week. And then there is recovery housing. There's peer recovery supports. The more you can wrap around somebody all of these different services at the correct level that they need at that time, including medications that are for substance use disorder treatment, the more likelihood they have of getting well and going on to live their life for their dreams like a lot of us have. Yeah.
Now, Steve, let me just turn it back to you. I know from the previous conversations we've had over the last couple of years that you've said, absolutely your research shows that 30 days doesn't work. You buy into the philosophy of it may be 18 months, 2 years, or even longer for somebody to actually have a chance at being successful with recovery from substance abuse. Why the long term? Why does it have to be that long?
Well, the brain is a remarkable organism and a remarkable organ. and it can actually rewire itself and heal itself. But the only thing, along with the other things that Deni mentioned, is time. You can do all the things that Deni was talking about, but you need time away from those substances. And the science says your outcomes are going to be much better as long as you get a minimum of 12 months. You know, if you get 12 months, and then if you can get it up to 2 years, you have a very good chance that you can make it a lifelong journey that is successful. So time is of the essence, no matter what the treatment protocol is.
That's true.
Once somebody has gone through that long process that you've just described, do they also need continual supports for the rest of their life?
Yes, not as intense as they do in the beginning years, but it's just like anything. When you have a problem, to have adequate support around, and there's programs out there, whether it be AA or NA or Refuge Recovery, things that people are doing, or like-minded people who have similar issues, that, as Deni said, the problem never goes away. And there are going to be times in your life where you have that urge. And if you're in a proper setting with people who understand, it'll help you forge your way through and not go back into the use of drugs.
Yeah. Okay. Dr. Carise, how about medication-assisted treatment?
Yeah.
Can you explain about that, or are there other variations of that?
Yeah, there are. I mean, the field of treatment in substance use disorders has been largely in two camps. You know, the abstinence-oriented is what they would be called, and the medication-assisted. And those two camps are kind of joining together really for the first time in my career, to where there is this view of medications as a valuable tool. So if you look back historically, the only medication we had was methadone, and it was required that methadone came with counseling. And I think it's always better to pair a medication with some kind of psychosocial counseling service. It's definitely the ideal. Just like I wouldn't give a diabetic insulin without talking to them about their diet or exercise or what they can do in addition to there are medications that will decrease craving for alcohol or opioids. There are medications that keep you kind of at a steady state with your opioid disorder. And most of the medications are for opioid use disorder. Some for alcohol, nothing on the horizon for cocaine or amphetamines. But there's medications that support you in all manner of different ways. And I think it's important, you wouldn't hold somebody's insulin because they're not exercising or dieting. So we don't want to hold a medication that can be helpful to people. Right now, we're in the business also of saving lives. People do not, I actually had a friend go out and use one more time, and she overdosed and died not knowing there was fentanyl in the cocaine. She had 3 years in recovery. This happens all the time. So right now, with the lethality of the substances out there, with not knowing what's in any of your drugs, with fentanyl being laced in cocaine and amphetamines now, we want to keep people alive, and the medications help us do that, as well as helping transition people.
Yeah. We're at the end of the segment, but when we come back, I want to kind of concentrate a little bit more on the fentanyl that you just mentioned, aspect of it. So we're going to take a break for commercial, everyone, and when we come back, we will hear more from Dr. Carise and from Steve Kiloli about substance abuse and its effect in the brain. Stay with us. Hi, welcome back to For the Health of It. And for those of you who are just tuning in, we have the pleasure today of talking with Dr. Deni Carise and Steve Kiloli about substance abuse and the science of substance abuse and how it is really a function of a disease of the brain. So when we finished up in the second section, we were talking about, you mentioned fentanyl.
Yes.
And how does that affect, I mean, we hear more about that nowadays than anything else, but how does that affect the person even more than, say, heroin or some of the others?
Yeah. So fentanyl, carfentanil, and all what we call the analogs of those drugs, which are made in clandestine laboratories. These are not pharmaceutical products. They are much more powerful and more potent than heroin and then the prescription opioids. So the epidemic is really run in three waves. The first was the prescription opioid epidemic, followed by heroin, followed now by fentanyl, carfentanil, and the analogs. The scariest thing I think about them, two things. One is that when somebody overdoses on fentanyl and they get Narcan, which is a remarkable life-saving drug that treats an overdose, doesn't treat addiction, treats the overdose, right? The fentanyl can actually stay in your system longer than the Narcan, so that you can actually overdose without taking any more drugs. So the Narcan half-life is shorter than the fentanyl. So it's incredibly important that people go to the hospital even if they feel okay. The other thing about it is that I'm trying to kind of grasp all the reasons, but for whatever reasons, drug dealers are now tainting cocaine and amphetamines with fentanyl. And for what we would call the opioid naive person, the person who has no dependency on an opioid, to get even a small amount of fentanyl can be deadly.
Wow.
Yeah.
What triggers relapse?
What triggers relapse? That's a great question. So I'll speak from my 30 plus years in the recovering community. I have seen, I've seen sadness trigger it. I've seen happiness trigger it. I've seen one of the biggest things I think I've seen trigger it are windfalls. Any kind of windfall. A parent dies and you inherit $100,000 or whatever. I've seen windfalls trigger it the most. From a scientific side, I will tell you the top 4 predictors of relapse for addiction, hypertension, diabetes, and asthma are the same. The top 4 predictors of relapse are lack of adherence to behavior change. You don't take your medication, you don't go to your meetings, you don't go out. Lack of adherence to behavior change. Mm-hmm. The next ones are really wholly unrelated, but they are the top predictors. Low family supports, psychiatric comorbidity, meaning you have a psychiatric disorder in addition to your other disorders, and low socioeconomic status. Top 4 predictors of relapse to all of the chronic diseases.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dr. Carise, why would somebody be addicted to one particular kind of drug and not another?
It's a good question. My bet is that there's a lot of genetics at play there, but I think there's also personal preference. So, cocaine, amphetamines, they bring you up, they give you energy. The opioids, the downers, they calm you down. So I think there's some personal choice, but there's also the genetics at play. Yeah.
Would economics play an aspect of that?
I do. I think economics. I think social aspects of that are present. You try what your friends are trying. First of all, and so there's a lot of that in there. Yeah.
What's your position on the medical marijuana?
How much time do you have?
We have about 3 minutes.
I think that there are few rare diseases like childhood seizure disorders where there's some great promise. Otherwise, I think we need a lot more research before we start looking at that as a cure for anything. And I think it is wholly ridiculous to call it a treatment for opioid dependence.
Yeah.
Based on the science.
Okay. All right. So I want to come back to you, and I know you've spent a tremendous amount of time and effort and money in trying to get to the bottom of this and educate the public. But your program at Manor of Hope, how does education and vocational training and employment, how is it involved in your treatment approach?
It's huge.
And why is it so important?
It's huge because all of the young men that walk through our doors have very low self-esteem. They've gone through events in their life that have just made them feel really bad about themselves. Most of them have had a very difficult time getting jobs and actually maintaining those jobs. And many of them just don't have any skills because they've spiraled out of control such that they don't get an education, they don't get job training. And then it's very difficult to actually get a job. Many of the guys have criminal records because of their drug use. And without skills, with a criminal record, possibly not being in the greatest socioeconomic situation, all the odds are stacked against them. So one of the things that we do that I'm proud of at our program is we kind of put the odds back in their favor. And we have a network of partners in our community that are open to hiring guys. Mm-hmm. And we train the guys on different things like resume writing and interview skills. And actually in January, we're opening our own vocational school in Spring City where we're starting out. Yeah, absolutely. We're very fortunate. We have a building there that we're going to be using. And we've dedicated 5,000 square feet of it to woodworking school where we're going to teach guys how to learn how to use tools and work with wood. and the program is scheduled to expand well beyond that into IT and many other areas. But as of January, we're going to do that. And then the guys don't have the obstacle of having to convince somebody to hire them. It's already there, and this school is going to exist not only for the Manor of Hope guys, but everybody else in the world of recovery, where they can come and get trained so they can become productive human beings out in the work world.
So you're building those supports that Dr. Carise talked about
Absolutely.
outside this process.
Recovery is multifaceted, and we're just an adjunct. Dr. Carise and a great program at Recovery Centers of America get things started, and then they kind of hand them off to somebody like us and other good programs out in the community where we continue the work. None of us can help people by themselves. It's really, you've heard the term, it takes a village. Well, recovery, it does take a village.
Yeah. It's a good way to end. Dr. Carise,
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been really, really, really instructive. Appreciate it. Of course, I admire you for what you do, and
Thank you.
continued good luck for the further development of Manor of Hope. So thank you
Thank
both
you.
for being here.
Thank you
Lev.
so much.
Well, that's about all the time we have, folks, for the show today. I truly hope that you've found that your time you've spent here understanding the science of substance abuse as a brain disease to be very helpful. I'm Lou Beccaria. It's been my pleasure to be your host. And remember, folks, if you're healthy, you're wealthy. I'll see you next time.